A 6-year-old beggar girl stopped a crippled millionaire on the street and, pointing to his leg, said, "I can give you back your leg. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to my channel to support my work." The mahogany cane tapped against the cold floor of the empty hallway, echoing through the silent mansion as Franklin Hartford dragged himself to his study. Each step was a painful reminder of what he had lost. The 70-year-old businessman paused for a moment, leaning heavily against the Italian silk wallpapered wall, trying to catch his breath. The Venetian mirror, hanging strategically in the hallway, reflected his imposing but broken figure. The impeccable Italian-cut suit couldn't completely disguise the void where his right leg should have been. His eyes met his own reflection, and for a moment he allowed the mask of coldness to slip, revealing all the weariness and bitterness accumulated in 2 decades of self-imposed isolation. 20 years. 20 years since the accident had stolen not only his mobility, but also any trace of humanity that remained in his heart. The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted his moment of vulnerability. Immediately, the mask of ruthless businessman returned, his eyes taking on that icy gleam that made employees tremble. "Mr. Hartford?" Gus, his driver and personal security, for nearly 3 decades, appeared in the hallway. He was one of the few who could still endure his explosive temper. "Dr. Evans is here for your appointment." Franklin grunted in acknowledgement, resuming his tortuous path to the study. The doctor was already waiting for him, settled in one of the Italian leather armchairs, his medical bag beside him. At 54, Evans was another of the few who weren't intimidated by his fits of rage. "You don't look good, Franklin," the doctor declared without preamble as the businessman settled heavily into his chair. "The tests are in. The circulation in your left leg is critically compromised. Get to the point, Evans. I don't have time for beating around the bush." The doctor leaned forward, his eyes revealing a seriousness that made Franklin feel a chill run down his spine. "If you don't start moving, we'll have to amputate the other leg in less than 6 months." The silence that followed those words was deafening. For a few moments, only the ticking of the antique clock and the sound of Franklin's heavy breathing filled the room. "Impossible," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Evans replied, his voice firm but gentle. "You've spent the last 10 years practically immobile, refusing to leave this mansion. The human body wasn't made for that, Franklin. You need to walk every day, starting now. Have you lost your mind? Look at me." Franklin gestured violently to his amputated leg. "How do you expect me to walk? With a cane, with help, with determination. You have all the necessary tools, state-of-the-art prosthetics that you've never used, an entire staff at your disposal. What's lacking is the will to live." The words hit Franklin like a slap. His hand gripped the arm of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Get out!" he hissed. "Get out of my study now!" "You have a choice to make, Franklin," Evans said calmly as he stood up. "You can continue hiding here, running your empire through computer screens until your body finally gives up, or you can fight. The decision is yours." The doctor left, leaving behind a Franklin trembling with anger and fear. Through the tall windows of the study, the afternoon sun cast elongated shadows on the expensive furniture, on the priceless paintings, on all the material symbols of the empire he had built. An empire that now seemed as empty as his heart. Hours passed as he remained motionless in his chair, the doctor's words echoing in his mind. Twilight was already painting the sky with orange hues when Gus reappeared. "Sir, may I bring you your dinner?" Franklin looked up, meeting the worried gaze of his oldest employee. For a moment, he glimpsed the distorted reflection of himself in the window glass, a bitter and lonely old man, surrounded by riches that couldn't buy what really mattered. "No," he replied, his voice surprisingly firm. "Bring me my cane, and Call the physical therapist, the one who tried to convince me to use the prosthetic last year." Gus couldn't completely hide his surprise, but he nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, immediately." "And Gus?" "Sir? Tomorrow morning I want you to prepare the car. We're going for a drive around the block." The words came out of his mouth before he could think better, before the fear could paralyze him again. Gus paused at the door, a discreet smile playing on his lips. "What time would you prefer, sir? 9 o'clock, before the streets get too busy." Franklin paused, swallowing hard. "And Gus? Stay close, I don't trust my legs." "Always, sir." Alone again in his study, Franklin Hartford stared at the darkness that was beginning to form outside. For the first time in a decade, he felt something different from the usual. Bitterness, a pang of fear, yes, but also something more. Something he had forgotten existed. Hope. Little did he know that his decision to face the outside world again would trigger a series of events that would change not only his life, but also the fate of people he didn't even know yet. Fate had its own plans for Franklin Hartford, plans that would begin to unfold the next morning in his first painful attempt to walk around the block. The morning dawned grey and cold, as if the weather itself was conspiring to test Franklin's determination. He was sitting on the edge of his king-size bed, staring at the titanium prosthetic he had never used, a state-of-the-art piece of equipment that had cost a small fortune and had remained stored in his closet for the past 3 years. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to fit it, cursing under his breath with each frustrated attempt. Pride had prevented him from asking for help, even when Gus knocked discreetly on the door twice, offering assistance. After almost an hour of trial and error, he finally managed to position the equipment correctly, but the discomfort was immense. "Ridiculous," he muttered to himself, watching his reflection in the mirror. The custom-tailored suit, which normally gave him an air of authority, now seemed only to emphasize his fragility. The mahogany cane, leaning against the wall, seemed to mock him. 9:15 in the morning. He was already late for his own schedule, and that irritated him deeply. Franklin Hartford was never late. It was one of the inflexible rules that had built his empire. Punctuality was respect, and he demanded respect. When he finally emerged from his quarters, he found not only Gus, but also Beatrice, his trusted housekeeper, waiting in the hallway. The lady's face, already marked by time, showed a maternal concern that irritated him even more. "I don't need an audience," he growled, leaning heavily on the cane as he took his first step out of the room. The pain was immediate and intense, radiating throughout his left leg. He clenched his teeth, refusing to show weakness, but his face paled visibly. "Mr. Hartford," Beatrice began, her voice soft, "perhaps it would be better to wait for the physical therapist." "I said I don't need an audience," he exploded, his voice echoing through the empty corridors of the mansion. "Gus, the car, now!" The walk to the front door had never seemed so long. Each step was a battle, against the pain, against the discomfort of the ill-fitting prosthesis, against his own wounded pride. When he finally reached the door, thick beads of sweat dripped down his face. The black Mercedes-Benz waited at the circular entrance of the mansion, its gleaming metal reflecting the cloudy sky. Gus held the door open, his face a mask of professional neutrality that hid his concern. "No," Franklin said abruptly, "I'm not going to hide inside the car, I'm going to walk." "Sir, the forecast calls for rain." "I don't care if it's raining cats and dogs," his voice thundered. "You're going to walk with me, Gus, at a distance. I don't want anyone glued to me as if I were an invalid." The first gust of cold wind hit him as soon as the main gates opened. Franklin hadn't stepped on the sidewalk of his own street in so long that the sensation was almost surreal. The upscale neighborhood where he lived remained elegant as ever. Old trees lined the streets, imposing mansions protected by high walls, perfectly paved roads. His first steps were hesitant, clumsy. The prosthetic made a soft, metallic noise with each movement, a constant reminder of his condition. Gus kept a few meters behind, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of trouble. The pain continued to be intense, but now there was something else, a strange feeling of exposure. The windows of the neighboring houses seemed like curious eyes, watching his public degradation. He imagined the curtains moving, the whispers of the servants. Look, old Hartford has finally come out of his burrow. He was so absorbed in his bitter thoughts that he almost didn't notice the first drop of rain. Soon others followed, forming a fine, icy drizzle. Gus immediately approached, an umbrella ready in his hands. "No!" Franklin protested. "I told you to keep your distance." That's when it happened. A misstep, the canes slipping on the wet pavement. For one terrifying moment, Franklin felt his entire body lose balance. His arms flailed in the air, desperately searching for support, finding only emptiness. The ground was approaching rapidly. The impact, however, never came. Gus, with the agility of his years of training, managed to reach him in time, holding him by the arms. For a few seconds, the two men remained frozen in that position, the powerful businessman completely dependent on his employee to avoid falling. It was at this very moment that a child's voice cut through the damp morning air. "Are you crying, mister?" Franklin looked up, still partially supported by Gus, and found a pair of dark eyes staring at him with curiosity. A little girl, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, was standing on the sidewalk. Her simple dress was dirty and worn. Her disheveled black hair framed a face that was too thin for her age. But it was her eyes that held Franklin's attention. There was something in them, an ancient wisdom that seemed out of place in such a young child. "Don't be ridiculous," he replied sharply, finally managing to straighten up with Gus's help. "It's the rain." The girl tilted her head slightly, as if studying a particularly interesting puzzle. Then, to the complete astonishment of the two men, she took a step forward and declared with surprising conviction, "I can give you back your leg." The absurdity of that statement made Franklin let out a harsh laugh, which sounded more like a bark. "Girl, get out of here before I—" His words were brutally interrupted by the sound of tires screeching on the wet asphalt. It all happened in a matter of seconds. A silver car emerged from the curve at high speed, skidding on the slippery road. The driver, clearly distracted by his cell phone, completely lost control of the vehicle. Franklin saw, as in slow motion, the car mount, the sidewalk coming directly towards him. His muscles locked up with terror, the memory of the accident 20 years ago completely paralyzing him. Gus was too far away to reach him in time. It was then that a blur of movement crossed his vision. The small figure of the girl lunged at him with surprising force, pushing him out of the vehicle's path. Franklin fell heavily on the lawn of one of the mansions, the prosthetic coming loose with the impact. The sound of the impact that followed would be etched in his memory forever. When he finally managed to sit up, his heart froze with the scene before his eyes. The little girl's body was lying several meters ahead, motionless as a broken doll, while a pool of blood began to form under her head, mixing with the rain that was now falling harder. The chaos that followed seemed to happen in two different speeds for Franklin. On the one hand, everything was a confused blur of movements and sounds. Distant sirens approaching, excited voices, people appearing from all directions. On the other hand, each second dragged on painfully as his eyes remained fixed on the small, motionless body on the sidewalk. Gus had taken control of the situation with impressive efficiency, preventing anyone from moving the girl until the paramedics arrived. The driver of the car, a young executive who was still holding his cell phone in trembling hands, was leaning against his damaged vehicle, his face as pale as wax. "My daughter! Let me through! She's my daughter!" The desperate voice cut through the air like a razor. A young woman was pushing her way through the onlookers who were already gathering, her thin body swaying visibly. Her disheveled brown hair and deep dark circles under her eyes told a story of suffering even before her words. "Livia! My God, Livia!" She fell to her knees beside the girl, her hands hovering over the small body without daring to touch it, as if fearing to cause more damage. It was then that her eyes met Franklin's, still sitting on the wet lawn, and something changed in her expression. "What happened to my daughter?" Her voice was filled with a mixture of pain and accusation. Before Franklin could answer, the paramedics arrived. The next half hour was a whirlwind of technical and efficient activity. Little Livia was immobilized with extreme care, each movement monitored by sophisticated equipment. The words exchanged between the professionals were tense, filled with medical terms that made the girl's mother pale even more. "Madam," one of the paramedics finally addressed her, "we need to take her immediately. The situation is critical." "To which hospital?" Her voice barely a whisper. "St. Luke's," replied the paramedic, hesitating before continuing. "Madam, are you the legal guardian? We need authorization for emergency procedures." Franklin watched, the woman's hands clutching the worn purse she carried, her eyes revealing a panic that went beyond maternal concern. I don't have," she began, her voice failing. "Not St. Luke's," Franklin heard himself saying, his voice automatically assuming the authoritative tone he used to command his empire. "Take her to Santa Clara. Gus, call Dr. Evans. Tell him I'm requesting his team with maximum urgency." Santa Clara was the most exclusive hospital in the city, known for serving only the elite. The paramedics exchanged hesitant glances. "Sir, protocol." "To hell with protocol," Franklin thundered, standing up with difficulty. "I'll take responsibility for all expenses. Gus, my wallet?" His driver was already at his side, handing him the gold card that opened all doors. Franklin extended it to the head paramedic. "Call the hospital now. Tell them Franklin Hartford is authorizing all necessary procedures. I want the best trauma team waiting when they arrive." The name had the desired effect. In a matter of minutes, the ambulance was speeding away, sirens cutting through the rainy morning. The girl's mother had boarded with her after a brief moment of hesitation and a confused look in Franklin's direction. "Gus, my car, now." "Sir," Gus began cautiously, "perhaps it would be better for you to return to—" "My car!" Franklin's voice brooked no argument. "And find my prosthetic." During the drive to the hospital, Franklin remained silent in the back seat of the Mercedes, his mind a whirlwind of contradictory thoughts. Why was he doing this? The girl was just another street child, one of the thousands who roamed the city. Her death would be tragic, yes, but why should it be his responsibility? The answer came in the form of a flash of memory, those dark, wise eyes, declaring with absolute certainty that they could give him back his leg. The absurd, childish statement now carried a different, almost prophetic weight. After all, wasn't that exactly what she had done? Push him to save his life, using her own legs, which now... He closed his eyes tightly, trying to push the thought away. Santa Clara was an impressive complex of glass and steel, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. At the entrance to the emergency room, Franklin found Dr. Evans already waiting, his face a mask of professional concern. "The girl is already in the trauma room," he informed him without preamble. "The situation is serious, Franklin. Head trauma, multiple fractures, and—" He hesitated. "And?" "The spine. There is significant damage to the lumbar region. We need to operate immediately, but even then..." His voice trailed off. "Even then what, Evans? Speak up." "Even with surgery, there's a high possibility of permanent paralysis from the waist down." The words hit Franklin like a punch to the gut. A wave of nausea washed over him, forcing him to lean against the nearest wall. The girl's mother? In the ICU waiting room, Franklin... Evans lowered his voice. She can't afford any of this. The social worker has already spoken to her. Apparently, they live in a temporary shelter. The mother is sick, can't work. I already said I'd cover all expenses, Franklin cut in sharply. It's not just that. She needs to authorize the surgery, but she's panicked. She doesn't trust the doctors. She thinks we're going to experiment on her daughter because she's... He hesitated again. Because she's poor, Franklin completed, a bitter taste in his mouth. Leaning heavily on his cane, he headed to the waiting room. He found the woman sitting alone in a corner, looking even smaller and more fragile under the fluorescent lights of the hospital. She looked up when he approached, and Franklin noticed that her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "Why are you doing this?" she asked before he could say anything. "Why are you helping us?" Franklin opened his mouth to answer, but realized he didn't have a ready answer. Why really? Because he felt guilty. Because the girl had saved his life. Because something in those childish eyes had awakened something he thought was dead long ago. "What's your name?" he asked instead. "Clarice," she replied, running a trembling hand over her face. "And you're Franklin Hartford. The nurse told me, the owner of half the buildings in the city." There was a hint of bitterness in her voice that bothered him. "Your daughter needs the surgery, Clarice. The doctors here are the best." And then, "What? When she needs treatment, physical therapy, follow-up, when you get tired of playing benefactor?" The harshness of those words hit him with unexpected force. How many times had he been that kind of man himself? The wealthy, powerful man who did charity on a whim, then went on with his life without looking back. He was interrupted in his thoughts by the abrupt arrival of a familiar figure, his niece, Marlene, dressed impeccably in an executive suit, her high heels echoing through the empty hallway. "Uncle, I just heard. Are you okay? Gus called me and..." She stopped when she noticed Clarice, her calculating eyes quickly assessing the situation. Franklin knew that look well. It was the same one he used to use in important negotiations. "Uncle." She lowered her voice, pulling him slightly by the arm. "We need to talk in private." Before he could answer, a doctor appeared at the door of the waiting room. "Miss Clarice, we need your authorization now. Every minute counts." Clarice stood up, her legs visibly wobbly. Her eyes met Franklin's once again, and in them was a mixture of fear, despair, and something else, a silent plea that he couldn't ignore. "Sign the papers," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I promise I won't abandon you." The words came out before he could think better, before he could calculate the implications or consult his lawyers. Beside him, he felt Marlene stiffen, but he didn't care. At that moment, all he could see were the eyes of little Livia, so full of wisdom and kindness, moments before sacrificing her own body to save a bitter old man she barely knew. The hours that followed were the longest in Franklin's memory since his own accident. Livia's surgery dragged on without news, while the movement in the hospital corridor oscillated between moments of intense activity and periods of oppressive silence. Clarice remained sitting in the same chair, her exhausted body bent over itself in an uncomfortable position, refusing to sleep. Marlene had tried several times to convince Franklin to go home, but he remained adamant. Something held him there, a force he couldn't explain rationally. He watched Clarice discreetly, noticing the occasional tremors that ran through her thin body, the way her hands sometimes fluttered uncontrollably. "You need to eat something," Gus said gently, offering a coffee and a sandwich he had gotten from the hospital cafeteria. Clarice shook her head negatively. "I can't. I need to save the money for the medicine." "I already said I'm covering all expenses," Franklin interrupted sharply. "You don't understand," Clarice replied, her voice laden with a fatigue that went beyond the physical. "It's not just Livia's expenses. I have multiple sclerosis. Each medicine costs more than I earned in a month when I could still work." The silence that followed that revelation was heavy. Franklin felt Marlene shift uneasily beside him, probably anticipating another thoughtless generosity from her. "Uncle, you used to be a dancer," Gus commented softly, surprising everyone. Faced with questioning looks, he explained, "I noticed from your posture even now. And there's a photo in your purse, half showing, you on a stage." Clarice's eyes filled with tears. "I was. At City Ballet. I had just gotten my first solo role when—" Her voice failed. "The first symptoms appeared during rehearsals. I thought it was just fatigue, stress. But then I started losing my balance, having spasms. When we finally found out what it was, I was already pregnant with Livia." She ran a trembling hand over her face, wiping away the tears that kept falling. Her father, Ricky, he couldn't handle it. He said he couldn't deal with a sick wife and a baby at the same time. He simply disappeared. "Bastard," Franklin muttered, surprising himself with the intensity of his indignation. "For a while I managed to get by," Clarice continued, as if she needed to justify her situation. "I had some savings. I gave dance lessons while I could still stand. But the medicines, they're so expensive. And without them, the symptoms get worse quickly. It was like a downward spiral. First we lost the apartment, then—" She was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Evans, still wearing his surgical scrubs. Everyone stood up instantly, Clarice needing to lean against the wall to maintain her balance. "She survived the surgery," he announced, and Clarice let out a sob of relief. "We managed to stabilize the spine and reduce the pressure on the brain, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The next 48 hours will be crucial. And even if everything goes well, the road to recovery will be long and difficult." "But she'll be able to walk again, won't she?" Clarice asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor exchanged a quick glance with Franklin before answering. "It's too early to make any definitive prognosis. The damage to the spine was severe. We'll need to wait for the swelling to subside to assess the actual extent of the damage. With intensive physical therapy, proper rehabilitation—" "How much?" Clarice interrupted, her face a mask of despair. "How much will all of this cost?" "Don't worry about that now," Franklin said firmly. "I already said that." "No!" Clarice exploded, surprising everyone with the strength in her voice. "You don't understand. I can't let my daughter build up hopes just too later. She staggered, her legs giving way. Gus caught her before she fell, helping her to sit down again. Dr. Evans immediately knelt before her, checking her vital signs with professional concern. "When was the last time you took your medication?" he asked, noticing the more intense tremors in her hands. Clarice looked away. It's been a few weeks. I had to choose between buying food for Livia or—" "Enough," Franklin cut in, his voice brooking no argument. "Evans, I want you to personally oversee her case as well. Gus, call Beatrice. Have her prepare the apartment on Park Avenue, the one we just renovated." "Uncle," Marlene finally interfered, her voice laden with alarm. "You can't be serious. That apartment is worth millions. And this woman, you don't even know her. How do you know it's not all a scam?" The look that Franklin gave his niece was so icy that she instinctively took a step back. "A scam," he repeated slowly. "You think that child threw her own body in front of a car as part of a con? That this woman destroyed her own career, her own body, all as part of an elaborate plan to extort money from a bitter old man like me?" Marlene opened her mouth to argue, but something in her uncle's expression made her recoil. Franklin turned to Clarice, who was watching the scene with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. "The apartment is 5 minutes from the hospital. It has an elevator, 24-hour security, and is fully furnished. You and Livia will move in there as soon as she's discharged. No discussion." "But," Clarice tried to protest. "No discussion," he repeated. You need to be strong to help your daughter in her recovery, and Livia will need a suitable environment for rehabilitation. At that moment, a nurse appeared at the door. Ms. Clarice, your daughter is waking up. She's asking for you. Clarice stood up with difficulty, her legs still trembling. Before following the nurse, she turned to Franklin, her eyes shining with restrained tears. Why? She asked again. Why are you doing all this for us? Franklin was silent for a long moment, his mind returning to that morning that seemed to have happened an eternity ago. The childish voice declaring that it could give him back his leg, the small body throwing itself in front of the car without hesitation, the ancient wisdom in those young eyes. Because your daughter taught me something that 20 years of wealth couldn't, he finally replied. She taught me that sometimes we need to lose our legs to find our humanity. When Clarice left, following the nurse through the white and sterile corridors, Marlene approached her uncle, her face a mask of calculated concern. You're making a mistake, she said softly. Let me at least do some research on their background, for your own protection. Franklin watched his niece for a moment, noticing for the first time something in her eyes that he had never noticed before. A calculating coldness that dangerously mirrored his own personality of the past 20 years. Do what you want, he replied finally, but don't interfere with my decisions. And Marlene, he paused significantly, don't try to manipulate me. I may be old and crippled, but I still know when someone is trying to pull a fast one on me. His niece forced a smile, but her eyes remained cold. Of course, Uncle, I'm just thinking of your best interests. As he watched her walk away down the hallway, her heels echoing on the marble floor, Franklin felt an unease growing in his chest. He was entering unfamiliar territory, driven by impulses he didn't fully understand. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. What he didn't know was that his decision to help Livia and Clarice had set in motion a series of events that would change not only their lives, but also reveal painful truths about those closest to him. The morning that had begun with his first attempt to walk around the block was about to turn into the first step of a journey far deeper and more dangerous than he could have imagined. The first meeting between Franklin and Livia after the accident took place 3 days later, when the girl was finally transferred from the ICU to a private room. The businessman was standing at the door, his hand gripping the cane with unnecessary force, observing the small figure in the hospital bed. Tubes and monitors made the tiny body seem even more fragile, but it was the girl's eyes that paralyzed him. The same wise and profound eyes that had challenged him that fateful morning, now clouded by pain and medication. You can come in. Mr. Hartford, Clarice said softly from the chair beside the bed. She looked a little better after receiving proper treatment, although the marks of exhaustion were still evident on her face. Livia turned her head slowly towards the door, and a small smile appeared on her pale lips. You're not crying anymore, she observed with the same disconcerting frankness as before. Franklin felt his throat tighten. He approached the bed with hesitant steps, the sound of the cane on the cold floor marking each movement. No, I'm not, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. And you? How are you feeling? I can't feel my legs, Livia replied with a simplicity that chilled his blood. But Mommy said it's normal, that it will go away when the hurt heals. The look that Clarice gave Franklin was loaded with silent despair. They both knew that the reality could be very different from the hopes they were trying to maintain. I brought something for you, Franklin said, gesturing to Gus, who was waiting discreetly in the hallway. The driver entered carrying a large, colorful box. Livia's eyes widened when Gus opened the box, revealing a state-of-the-art tablet, complete, with educational games and children's books. Is it for me? To help you pass the time while you recover? Franklin explained, noticing how Clarice bit her lip, probably mentally calculating the value of the gift. "But I don't know how to read very well," Livia admitted, a blush tinting her pale cheeks. "I only went to school a little bit before Mommy got too sick." The innocent comment hit Franklin like a punch to the gut. How many other basic things had been denied to this child by the cruelty of circumstances? "That can be solved," he heard himself saying. "When you get better, we'll arrange for the best tutors." He was interrupted by the abrupt arrival of Marlene, who burst into the room like a hurricane in her designer suit, carrying a thick folder under her arm. "Uncle, we need to talk, now." Something in her voice made Franklin turn sharply. He knew that tone. It was the same one his niece used when she was about to close a particularly lucrative deal. "I'm busy, Marlene." "It's important," she insisted, her eyes moving quickly between Livia and Clarice. "Family matter." Before Franklin could respond, Livia let out a small moan of pain. Immediately, Clarice leaned over her daughter delicately, adjusting her position in the bed. "I think it's best to let you rest a bit," Franklin said softly to the girl. "Gus will be in the hallway if you need anything." In the hallway, Marlene practically dragged her uncle to a small, empty meeting room, closing the door more forcefully than necessary. "What did you find out?" Franklin asked, recognizing the triumphant expression on his niece's face. Marlene opened the folder she was carrying, spreading documents on the table. "I did a thorough investigation into our newest charity projects," she began, her tone making her disapproval clear, "and I discovered some interesting things." "Get to the point. The story of the ballerina is true. Clarice Silva really danced at City Ballet, had a promising career. The diagnosis of multiple sclerosis is also real." She pushed some medical documents towards her uncle. "But there's more, much more." Franklin leafed through the papers distractedly, his irritation growing. "What exactly are you trying to prove, Marlene?" "That you're being manipulated, Uncle, as always." She pulled another document from the folder. Ricky Davis, Livia's father. He didn't simply disappear. He tried to fight for custody of the girl. That caught Franklin's attention. How? According to the court documents, he claimed that Clarice was mentally unstable, that her condition made her unable to properly care for the child. He offered a generous alimony in exchange for full custody. And she refused, Franklin concluded, feeling a pang of admiration for the former ballerina. "Yes, but that's not all." Marlene pulled more papers from the folder. "In the last 2 years, there have been 3 attempts to have Clarice involuntarily committed, all requested by Ricky, all claiming that she was putting her daughter's life at risk by living on the streets." "Scumbag," Franklin muttered. "Tries to take her daughter instead of helping." "Or maybe he was genuinely concerned about the child's well-being," Marlene argued. "Think, Uncle. A sick woman, without resources, dragging a small child through the streets. And now, coincidentally, that same child saves the life of one of the richest men in the city." Franklin slammed his hand on the table with surprising force. "Are you suggesting that that girl threw herself in front of a car on purpose, as part of some elaborate plan?" "I'm suggesting that you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment," Marlene replied, keeping her voice controlled. "As you always do when it comes to children, as you did with—" "Don't you dare!" Franklin cut in, his voice dangerously low. "Don't use that against me, Marlene." A heavy silence fell over the room. For a moment, uncle and niece stared at each other, decades of unspoken history hanging between them. "I'm just trying to protect you," Marlene finally said, her voice softer, "and your interests, which, I need to remind you, are also the interests of the company, of the hundreds of employees who depend on your decisions." "My interests," Franklin repeated, slowly, a bitter smile forming on his lips. "You mean your inheritance?" "Uncle." "No, Marlene. I'm going to be very clear. He stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. What I do with my money, with my life, is my decision. You can continue managing the part of the company that I entrusted to you, but don't interfere with this. Do we understand each other? Marlene also stood up, collecting her documents with precise and controlled movements. Perfectly, Uncle. I just hope you don't regret it later. When she left, Franklin remained in the room, his gaze lost on the window that overlooked the hospital garden. Down there, families strolled among the manicured flower beds. Visitors entered and left carrying flowers and balloons. Normal life going on, oblivious to the dramas that unfolded in the rooms above. It was Gus who found him like that, an hour later. Sir, Dr. Evans is looking for you. It's about the results of the girl's latest tests. Franklin nodded slowly, his face a mask of determination. Let's go. As he walked through the hospital corridors, leaning on his cane, a certainty formed in his mind. No matter what Marlene thought, no matter what his past screamed in his ears, this time he wouldn't let fear and distrust govern his actions. What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, Marlene was in her private office, making a call that would change the course of everything. Hello? Yes, I need your services again. It's about that matter we discussed. No, this time I need something more. Permanent. How much? The price doesn't matter. Just make sure it can't be traced. Back to me. On the other end of the line, a gravelly voice asked some specific questions. No physical violence, Marlene specified, her voice professional and controlled. Just make sure they seem unstable, dangerous. I have some contacts at Child Protective Services who can help with the rest. And Clarice, well, she already has a convenient history of mental instability, doesn't she? Hanging up the phone, Marlene allowed herself a small smile. Years of looking after her uncle's interests had taught her that sometimes it was necessary to make difficult decisions for the greater good. And if that meant destroying the life of a sick woman and her daughter, well, she was willing to carry that weight. The days in the hospital began to follow a strangely domestic routine. Franklin arrived every morning promptly at 9 o'clock, bringing with him an aura of determination that infected the medical team. He spent hours watching Livia's physical therapy sessions, his wrinkled face contracted in a mask of concentration, as if he could, through pure force of will, make the small legs move again. The girl faced each session with a bravery that left the adults around her speechless, even when the pain was unbearable, even when tears streamed silently down her face. She maintained a determined smile. "Do you know why I don't give up?" she asked Franklin one afternoon, while resting after a particularly difficult session. "Because Mommy doesn't give up either. Even when it hurts a lot, she keeps trying." The comment made Franklin look at Clarice, who was sleeping exhaustedly in an armchair in the corner of the room. Since starting proper treatment, her condition had improved visibly, but the years of forced neglect had left deep marks. "You haven't given up either," Livia continued, her childish voice carrying that disconcerting wisdom that so intrigued Franklin. "That's why you started walking on the street again, even though you were scared." "How did you?" he began, surprised. "I could see it in your eyes," she replied simply. "The same as in Mommy's eyes when she has to do something that scares her." Before Franklin could answer, a nurse entered the room, carrying a tray with medications. She was a new professional, whom he didn't recognize from the regular staff. "Time for the medicines," she announced with a smile that didn't reach. Her eyes, something in the nurse's behavior, triggered an alert in Franklin. His years in the business world had sharpened his instinct to perceive when something wasn't quite right. "Wait," he said, his voice automatically assuming the tone of command. "I don't recognize these medications. Where is Marina?" "Nurse Marina is off today," the woman replied, her smile faltering slightly. I'm her substitute. Even so, Franklin insisted. I want to confirm with Dr. Evans first. The nurse hesitated for a fraction of a second, enough time to confirm Franklin's suspicions. Gus, he called out loudly. His driver, who as always was on guard in the hallway, immediately entered the room. A look from Franklin was enough for him to understand the situation. With movements surprisingly agile for his size, Gus blocked the door when the fake nurse tried to escape. The ensuing commotion woke Clarice. The tray fell to the floor, scattering pills of different colors than usual. The woman was restrained by the hospital security, and a quick analysis of the medications revealed a combination that could have caused a serious reaction in Livia. "Who sent you?" Franklin demanded, his voice trembling with contained anger. The woman kept her lips firmly closed, but her eyes moved quickly towards the bag she was carrying. Gus picked it up from the floor, finding inside it a brown envelope containing a considerable amount of money and a phone number written on a piece of paper. "Call the police," Franklin ordered. But the fake nurse finally spoke. "It won't do any good. I don't know who hired me. It was all by phone, payment in, cash, professional." Franklin felt a chill run down his spine. He knew this type of operation well. That's how big businessmen used to solve their problems discreetly. "I need to get you out of here," he said to Clarice, who was hugging Livia protectively. "The hospital is no longer safe." "But she hasn't been discharged yet," Clarice protested. "The physical therapy—" "I can set up a complete structure in the apartment," Franklin replied, his mind already working on the logistics. "Equipment, trusted nurses, everything. Gus, call Beatrice, tell her I need her at the Park Avenue apartment immediately, and then call Dr. Evans." While the arrangements were being made, Franklin couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that he knew the style of this operation. It was methodical, professional, discreet, exactly like, no, it couldn't be. She wouldn't be capable, but the seed of doubt was planted. The transfer happened in the dead of night, with a discretion that would have impressed secret agents. The Park Avenue apartment, which was already prepared to receive Clarice and Livia eventually, was transformed in record time into a small private clinic, with all the necessary equipment for the girls' recovery. Beatrice, Franklin's housekeeper, personally supervised every detail, from the adaptation of the bathrooms to the installation of grab bars in the corridors. The experience she had in caring for Franklin after his own accident proving invaluable. "The room is beautiful," Livia exclaimed when she was finally settled in her new bed, her eyes shining as she saw the newly painted walls in soft shades of blue and green. "It looks like a princess room." Clarice, however, seemed uncomfortable amidst so much luxury. Franklin found her standing in the main room, looking through the panoramic window that offered an impressive view of the city. "All of this wasn't necessary," she said softly, when she noticed his presence. "We were already so grateful for the help at the hospital. Someone tried to hurt your daughter today," Franklin interrupted her. "Someone with enough resources and influence to infiltrate a person into the hospital. That's not a coincidence." Clarice turned to face him, her eyes reflecting an ancient fear. You think it was Ricky?" "I don't know," Franklin answered honestly. "But I intend to find out." At that moment, Gus appeared at the door with a grave expression. "Sir, call from Dr. Evans. It's urgent." Franklin took the phone, listening attentively as the doctor spoke. His face became paler and paler. "I understand," he finally said. "No, keep that a secret for now. I'll take care of it." When he hung up, he found Clarice watching him anxiously. "What happened?" "Someone tried to access Livia's medical records," he explained, "and yours too. When they couldn't, they tried to bribe an employee of the archives. The person said they represented Child Protective Services." Clarice staggered, needing to lean against the wall. "No, not again," That's how Ricky tried to take Livia from me last time, she explained, her voice trembling. Using contacts at Child Protective Services, forging reports about my inability to care for her. Franklin felt his blood run cold. It was exactly the kind of strategy that Marlene would use. Influence, manipulation of documents, all done behind the scenes without leaving a trace. I need to make a call, he said abruptly, heading to the office that had been set up in the apartment. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number of his most trusted private investigator. I need everything you can find on Marlene Hartford's recent activities, he instructed as soon as the man answered. Especially bank transfers, phone calls, unregistered meetings, and be discreet, very discreet. After hanging up, Franklin remained seated in silence, watching the city lights through the window. If his suspicions were correct, his own niece was trying to destroy the life of an innocent child just to maintain her control over the family fortune. The sound of childish laughter coming from Livia's room cut through his somber thoughts. Beatrice had apparently managed to make the girl smile, probably with one of her old stories. Sir, Gus called softly from the door. There's something else you need to know. About the fake nurse. What is it? She was found dead in her apartment. Apparently overdose. The police are classifying it as suicide. Franklin closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 2 decades of dirty business games fall on his shoulders. He knew this script well. Inconvenient witnesses eliminated accidentally, traces erased professionally. Gus, he called as his driver was already leaving, double the security on the building, and don't let Marlene get near this apartment, under any circumstances. As night fell over the city, Franklin Hartford felt that he was about to enter a battle very different from the ones he was used to fighting in the business world. This time, he wasn't fighting for money or power, but for the life and safety of 2 people who, inexplicably, had become important to him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt fear, not for himself, but for Livia and Clarice. Because he knew well what Marlene was capable of when she felt threatened. His niece had learned too well the lessons of cruelty in business that he himself had taught over the years. The days in the Park Avenue apartment began to develop a routine of their own. The mornings were dedicated to Livia's physical therapy, now conducted by a team rigorously selected and investigated by Gus. The afternoons were filled with lessons. Private tutors came to help the girl catch up on lost time away from school, while a specialized nurse supervised Clarice's treatments. Franklin spent more and more time in the apartment, following the progress and setbacks of both. He had transformed one of the rooms into an office, from which he ran his business through video conferences, always with an ear attentive to the sounds coming from Livia's room. It was during one of these seemingly quiet afternoons that Beatrice found something disturbing. Mr. Hartford, the housekeeper called discreetly from the door of the office, her normally serene face marked by concern. Could you come a moment? It's about Ms. Clarice's medicines. Franklin followed her to the kitchen, where Beatrice pointed to some pills scattered on the counter. I noticed that the color is different than usual, she explained. And the shape, too. But the packaging is the same. Franklin examined the medications carefully. To less trained eyes, the difference would be imperceptible. But Beatrice, after years of taking care of his own medication, had developed a clinical eye for detail. When did the change start? He asked, his voice tense. This morning. The new shipment arrived last night. Who made the delivery? A delivery guy said he was from the usual pharmacy. Franklin felt his stomach sink. Immediately, he picked up his phone and called Dr. Evans. I need you to analyze some medications, now. While they waited for the doctor to arrive, Franklin watched Clarice through the ajar door of the living room. She was having one of her tremor attacks, stronger than normal. Could it be? The medicines have been tampered with, Dr. Evans confirmed 2 hours later after a preliminary analysis in his portable laboratory. The composition is similar, but there are additional substances, stimulants mainly. In increasing doses, they could significantly aggravate the symptoms of sclerosis, making it seem that the disease is progressing faster than normal, Franklin completed, his voice loaded with icy fury. Exactly, and worse, causing mood swings, anxiety, possibly even psychotic episodes. To make it seem that she is mentally unstable, Gus added quietly, as in the previous attempts to take custody of the girl. Franklin leaned heavily on his cane, feeling the weight of each of his 70 years. How long has she been taking? The altered medicines? From the symptoms I've observed, probably a few weeks, the doctor replied. The changes must have started still in the hospital. And I didn't notice, Franklin murmured, the guilt evident in his voice. No one would notice, Dr. Evans tried to console him. It was done very professionally. The question is, what do we do now? Before Franklin could answer, a sharp scream cut through the air. It came from Livia's room. Everyone ran there, or in Franklin's case, limped as quickly as possible. The scene they found made the blood run cold in their veins. Livia was having some kind of seizure, her small body convulsing in the bed, while Clarice, in panic, tried to hold her. "Everyone stand back!" Dr. Evans commanded, immediately taking control of the situation. "Gus, my bag. Beatrice, call the ambulance." The following minutes were a blur of frenetic activity. When they finally managed to stabilize Livia, the girl was semi-conscious, mumbling disjointed words. "What happened?" Clarice asked, her voice choked with tears. Dr. Evans examined the half-empty glass of water on Livia's bedside table, sniffing it carefully. "There's something here," he declared. "We need a complete analysis, but I'd bet it's the same substances as the altered medicines, in a much larger dose." "But how?" Beatrice asked, confused. "I myself bring her the water, always in sealed bottles." "The bottle?" Gus interrupted suddenly. "The one I brought this morning. The seal was kind of loose. I thought it was a factory defect." "Someone had access to the apartment," Franklin concluded, his voice dangerously calm. "Someone with the keys." At that moment, as if to confirm his suspicions, his phone vibrated with a message. It was from his private investigator. "I found something. Marlene made 3 large cash withdrawals in recent weeks and had unregistered meetings with a known problem solver from the business world. I need to show you the rest in person. It's worse than we imagined." Franklin stared at the message for long moments, feeling a growing fury take over his body. His own niece, his own blood. "Gus," he called, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the room. "Call the locksmith. I want all the locks changed immediately and install cameras. In every room, every hallway, every entrance." "It's already done, sir," Gus replied, surprising everyone. "I had them installed last night, after the incident with the medicines. The cameras are discreet, but high definition, and they transmit directly to my phone." Franklin looked at his driver with a new admiration. After so many years, Gus still managed to surprise him with his ability to anticipate. "The images," he realized suddenly. "You must have recorded who switched the bottle." Gus nodded gravely, taking his phone. "At 5:47 in the morning, when everyone was still asleep. The black and white images showed a slender figure, dressed in the uniform of the cleaning staff, sneaking into the kitchen. The face was partially covered by a surgical mask, but the elegant movements and posture were unmistakable." "Marlene," Franklin whispered, his heart clenching with a pain that had nothing to do with his missing leg. "There's more," Gus continued, his voice heavy. "The hallway cameras caught her talking to someone on the phone. The audio isn't perfect, but..." He turned up the volume, and Marlene's voice, even muffled, was clear enough. "No, it's still not enough. I need her to seem completely out of control. Child Protective Services won't act without concrete evidence. And remember, nothing that can be traced back to me. When we're done, everyone will believe that that sick woman has finally gone crazy and tried to hurt her own daughter." The recording continued, but Franklin had already heard enough. With a gesture, he asked Gus to stop. "Sir?" Beatrice called softly, noticing how her boss had paled. "What are we going to do?" Franklin looked at Livia, now sleeping restlessly under the effect of sedatives, at Clarice, trembling in her chair with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. 20 years ago, after his accident, he had closed himself off in his mansion, letting bitterness consume his humanity. He had transformed Marlene into his image and likeness, teaching her to be ruthless in business, to see people as pieces on a chessboard. Now he was reaping the bitter fruits of his own lessons. "Gus!" he called, his voice carrying a determination that he hadn't felt in decades. "Call my lawyer. I want to start the proceedings to remove Marlene from all my businesses. Today." "But sir," Gus hesitated, "she knows all the secrets of the company, all the questionable operations of the last 20 years. "I know," Franklin replied, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Knowledge is power. It was the first lesson I gave her." A sound of childish laughter coming from the next room interrupted his somber thoughts. Livia was having a good morning. The effects of the intoxication had finally begun to subside, and she had managed to move her toes slightly during the physical therapy session. "You should see it," Beatrice said, entering the office with a tray of tea. "The girl is so excited. She said she felt a tingling in her legs." Franklin allowed a small smile to soften his tired features. "And Clarice?" "Improving little by little," Beatrice replied, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Since she started taking the correct medications again, the tremors have decreased. But? She's scared, sir, more than she shows. Last night I found her crying, hidden on the balcony. She thinks it's her fault, that her illness is putting her daughter in danger." Franklin closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt on his shoulders. It wasn't Clarice's illness that was putting Livia in danger. It was his own presence in their lives that had attracted Marlene's predatory attention. The phone rang again. This time, it was his lawyer. "We have a problem." Dr. Miller's voice sounded tense on the other end of the line. "Marlene has filed for guardianship against you." "What?" "She's claiming that you're showing signs of senile dementia, that your recent decisions demonstrate a lack of mental capacity to manage your business. She has statements from 3 doctors attesting to significant changes in your behavior." Franklin let out a harsh laugh. "Poor doctors, obviously. But they're respected professionals with impeccable credentials. And she has more. She's gathered documents showing patterns of irrational spending in recent weeks. The apartment, the medical treatments, the adaptations. Spending on a child's health is irrational now." "Franklin," the lawyer sighed heavily, "you know the game. She's painting a very convincing picture of an elderly man, emotionally weakened after years of isolation, being manipulated by a cunning woman and her daughter." Before Franklin could answer, a sharp scream cut through the air. It came from Livia's room. "I need to hang up," he said quickly, disconnecting the phone without waiting for an answer. Leaning on his cane, he headed as quickly as possible to the girl's room. The scene he found made his heart clench. Livia was crying, clinging to Clarice, while the physical therapist tried to calm them down. "What happened?" "She tried to get up on her own," the physical therapist explained, her professional voice barely disguising her concern. "When she couldn't, she panicked. I felt my legs," Livia sobbed. "I swear I felt them. Why can't I get up?" "Honey," Clarice began, her voice trembling, "the doctor explained that it takes time. But I want to walk now. I want to dance like you used to dance, Mommy. I want to—" Her voice was interrupted by a new wave of sobs. Franklin felt something inside him break. Limping to the bed, he sat on the edge of the mattress. "Livia," he called softly, waiting until she looked at him. "Remember what you told me in the hospital about not giving up?" The girl nodded through her tears. "Do you know why I didn't give up trying to walk after my accident?" he continued, his voice taking on a tone that he had never used before, gentle, almost paternal. "Because every small progress, no matter how small, was a victory. Today you felt your legs, didn't you?" "Yes," she murmured. "Then this is your victory today. Tomorrow, who knows, you'll be able to move your fingers more. Then maybe your ankle. Each day, a small victory. But it hurts so much. I know, little one. Believe me, I know." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Want to know a secret? It still hurts for me too. Every day. But you know what I discovered? Pain isn't our enemy. It tells us that we're still fighting, that we haven't given up." Livia stared at him with those wise eyes that so disconcerted him. "Do you cry sometimes too?" The question caught him by surprise. For a moment, he was transported back to that rainy morning, when she had found him on the sidewalk, a proud old man with tears he pretended were raindrops. "Yes," he admitted finally. "Sometimes I cry, and there's no shame in that." The girl extended her small hand, touching Franklin's wrinkled face with surprising gentleness. "Then we can cry together when it hurts too much. And then we keep trying." Something warm and wet trickled down Franklin's face. And this time he didn't try to disguise it. He let Livia see his tears, let her understand that even proud old men could be vulnerable. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Gus's phone. The driver answered, his face assuming a grave expression as he listened. "Sir," he called after hanging up. "It was our contact at the hospital. Marlene was there earlier today talking to the social worker. Apparently, she's preparing a report on Clarice's mental condition." Clarice paled visibly, her tremors returning with force. "No, not again. She won't succeed," Franklin declared, with a firmness that surprised everyone. "Not this time." Standing up with difficulty, he picked up his own phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Tony, it's Franklin Hartford. I need a favor. Remember that dossier you kept for me? About the company's special operations over the last 20 years. Yes, that same one. It's time to use it." When he hung up, he found everyone staring at him with confused expressions. "What was that about?" Gus asked finally. "My insurance," Franklin replied with a bitter smile. "Marlene isn't the only one who has kept evidence over the years. The difference is that my evidence can send people to jail." "But that might harm you too, sir?" Beatrice asked worriedly. "Probably, but I've lived too long hiding behind papers and fortunes. It's time to do the right thing, no matter the cost." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to underline the weight of his decision, his phone rang again. It was a message from Marlene. "We need to talk, Uncle. You can still turn back. Don't force me to destroy everything we've built." Franklin looked at the message for a long moment, then at Livia, who had finally stopped crying and was now resting in her mother's arms. "No," he murmured to himself. "This time I won't turn back." The silent war between uncle and niece reached a new level in the following week. The dossier that Franklin had kept as collateral proved to be a powerful weapon. A single meeting with the board of directors, where some strategically selected documents were accidentally revealed, was enough for the support for the attempted guardianship to begin to dwindle. Marlene, however, wasn't the type to back down easily. If she could no longer count on business allies, she changed her strategy to a more personal attack. The first bomb dropped on a seemingly quiet morning. Franklin was in Livia's room, watching her physical therapy session, when Gus entered with a tablet in his hands and a worried expression. "Sir, I think you better see this." It was the front page of one of the city's leading news portals. The headline made his blood run cold. Elderly businessman under influence of con artists. The story behind the Hartford Empire. The article, signed by a journalist known for his investigative reports, painted an unflattering portrait of Clarice. Old photos of when she lived on the streets were presented alongside leaked medical records, suggesting a history of mental instability. Livia's accident was described as suspiciously convenient, with insinuations that the girl may have been deliberately placed in the path of the car. "Don't let Clarice see this," Franklin ordered immediately, but it was too late. The news was already circulating rapidly on social media, and soon the apartment's phone began to ring incessantly, with reporters wanting comments. "Mommy!" Livia called, noticing the adult's agitation. "What's happening?" Clarice, who had just seen the news, on her own cell phone, was desperately trying to contain her tears. Her tremors had returned with full force, her hands barely able to hold the device. "It's nothing, honey." She tried to smile, but her voice failed. "Just some people saying nonsense." "They're saying we're bad," Livia declared surprisingly. "The math teacher was reading it on her phone. She didn't know I could see the screen reflected in the window glass." But the revelation that even the private tutors were reading and possibly believing those lies was too much for Clarice. She staggered towards the door, clearly needing a moment alone. "Beatrice," Franklin called softly, "stay with Livia for a moment." He found Clarice on the balcony, sobbing convulsively while leaning on the railing. Her tremors were so intense that he feared she might fall. "They're right," she murmured when she noticed his presence. "I'm a danger to my own daughter. If it weren't for me, she'd have a normal life with a father, a house." "Stop," Franklin interrupted her firmly. "Don't let Marlene win like this. But look at the facts. My daughter is in a wheelchair because I couldn't give her a decent life, because I was too sick, too weak to—" "Your daughter is alive because you taught her to be strong," Franklin cut in, "to be brave, to care about others even when life hasn't been fair to her." He limped to stand beside her on the railing, watching the city below. "You know why Marlene is doing this? Because she's exactly what I was a few months ago. Someone who only sees value in money, in power. Someone who has lost the ability to see the true strength in people." Clarice wiped away her tears with the back of her trembling hand. "What strength? I can barely hold a cup of coffee without spilling it." "Strength isn't in the muscles," he replied softly. "It's here." He touched her chest lightly. "The same strength that made you refuse money in exchange for your daughter, that made you keep fighting even when everything seemed lost." At that moment, Gus appeared at the balcony door. "Sir, we have a bigger problem." He extended his tablet, showing an email that had just arrived. It was from Child Protective Services, summoning an emergency hearing to assess Livia's guardianship. "Conditions? They can't do that," Clarice exclaimed, the panic evident in her voice. "Not without evidence, without—" "They can, if they believe there is immediate risk to the child," Gus explained gently, "and with all this exposure in the media." "When?" Franklin asked, his voice assuming the authoritarian tone of times of difficult negotiations. "Tomorrow morning." The silence that followed was heavy, interrupted only by Clarice's muffled sobs. "Gus," Franklin finally spoke. "Call Dr. Evans. I need a complete report on Clarice's condition in recent weeks, especially on the manipulation of the medications." "Beatrice." He raised his voice slightly, and the housekeeper appeared. "Immediately, prepare a folder with all of Livia's progress records, including the teacher's assessments." "But, sir," Gus hesitated, "the hearing is tomorrow. How are we going to—" "We'll work all night if we have to," Franklin cut in. "And there's one more thing I need you to do. That detective who was investigating Marlene, tell him I need him here, now." While Gus left to make the calls, Franklin turned to Clarice, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. "Go stay with your daughter," he said softly. "She needs to see you strong now." How can I be strong when I'm about to lose her? You won't lose her, Franklin declared with a certainty he didn't really feel. Not while I can do something about it. The rest of the day turned into a whirlwind of activity. The apartment became a kind of makeshift operations center, with people coming and going constantly. Dr. Evans arrived with a pile of medical documents, x-rays, and exams. The private detective brought evidence of Marlene's suspicious activities, including records of bank transfers and compromising phone recordings. Livia watched everything with her wise and worried eyes, clearly understanding more than the adults imagined. "Uncle Franklin," she called when he passed by the door of her room for the 10th time that night. The way she called him, Uncle, made his heart clench in a strange way. "Yes, little one? They're not going to take me away, are they?" The question, asked with a mixture of childish fear and forced maturity, hit him like a punch to the gut. He limped to her bed, sitting on the edge of the mattress. "No," he replied firmly. "They're not. Promise?" Franklin hesitated. In his 70 years of life, he had learned not to make promises that he wasn't sure he could keep. But looking at that small figure in the bed, at those eyes that had seen too much suffering for her age, he knew that some promises needed to be made, no matter the cost. "I promise," he said, holding her small hand between his. "And you know why? Because you taught me something very important." "What?" "That sometimes we need to be brave, not only for ourselves, but for the people we love." At that moment, a movement at the door caught his attention. It was Gus, his face more serious than usual. "Sir, call from the investigator. He's found something that changes everything." Franklin found the private investigator Tony waiting in his makeshift office. The man was holding a thick folder and had deep, dark circles under his eyes, signs that he had spent the entire night working. "What did you find?" Franklin asked without preamble, closing the door behind him. "Before I show you, I need you to understand something," Tony began, his tone unusually hesitant. "What I found goes beyond the current dispute. It will explain a lot, but it will also open old wounds." Franklin felt a chill run down his spine. "Continue." Tony opened the folder and began to spread documents on the table. "I started investigating Marlene's recent activities, as you asked, but something didn't add up. Her patterns of behavior, the obsession in destroying Clarice and Livia, it seemed too personal. And so I started digging deeper, 20 years ago to be exact, at the time of your accident." Franklin felt his legs, the real and the absent, weaken. He needed to lean heavily on the table. "What about my accident? You always believed it was a fatality, right? A drunk driver, a rainy night. Where are you going with this?" Tony picked up a specific document from the pile. It was an old police report, yellowed by time. "The driver who hit your car that night, he wasn't drunk. In fact, he wasn't even alive when the car hit yours." Franklin felt the blood run cold in his veins. "What do you mean?" "He was already dead at the wheel, carbon monoxide poisoning. The car was adapted to direct the exhaust gas into the cabin. It was made to look like an accident, but it was an execution." "My God," Gus murmured, from the door where he had entered silently. "But why?" Franklin asked, his voice hoarse. "Who?" "The driver was Joey Rizzo," Tony continued, his professional voice barely disguising his discomfort. "A former employee of your company who had been fired a week earlier. Apparently, he had discovered some accounting irregularities and threatened to report them." Franklin closed his eyes, old memories flooding his mind. He vaguely remembered the case, a junior accountant who had made accusations about embezzlement. At the time, he had let Marlene take care of the situation. "No," he murmured, the realization hitting him like lightning. "She wouldn't." "She did," Tony confirmed softly, pushing more documents towards him. I found records of bank transfers, recorded conversations. Marlene orchestrated everything. She used Rizzo as the perfect scapegoat, a disgruntled employee with financial problems, motive for revenge. But she was only 22 years old, Gus completed, and she was already learning to solve problems the way you had taught her. Franklin staggered to the nearest chair, feeling the weight of 2 decades of inconsistent guilt collapse on his shoulders. The accident wasn't to kill me, he realized suddenly. It was to incapacitate me, to make me dependent. Tony nodded gravely. With you weakened, she took more and more control of the company. Every important decision passed through her. Every document needed her approval. And I let it happen, Franklin murmured. I practically handed everything over to her. But there's more, Tony continued, his voice getting even more serious. When I started investigating Clarice's case, I found connections, disturbing ones. He picked up another set of documents. Ricky Davis, Clarice's ex-husband. He works for a subsidiary of your company, one that is under Marlene's direct control. What? The attempts to take custody of Livia, the false reports about Clarice's mental instability, it was all orchestrated. By Marlene, she used company resources to manipulate the situation, to ensure that Clarice and Livia ended up on the streets. But why? Gus asked, expressing the confusion that Franklin felt. Why so much effort to destroy a former ballerina and her daughter? Tony picked up a last document from the folder. It was an old birth certificate. Because Clarice isn't just any former ballerina. She is the daughter of Joey Rizzo. The silence that fell over the office was deafening. Franklin stared at the birth certificate without really seeing it, his mind trying to process the magnitude of this revelation. Marlene knew, he finally said. She knew all along. Yes, Tony confirmed. When Clarice began her career at City Ballet, Marlene identified her, and when she found out about the pregnancy, the illness, she saw an opportunity to get revenge, Franklin completed, the bile rising in his throat. To punish the family of the man she used to incapacitate me. And now, Gus added softly, when you started helping those very people, she panicked, Franklin concluded, because she knew that if I discovered the truth. A scream coming from Livia's room interrupted the conversation. The 3 men ran, or in Franklin's case, limped as quickly as possible, there. The scene they found made Franklin's blood run cold. Marlene was standing in the middle of the room, holding an envelope in her hands. Clarice was lying on the floor, apparently unconscious, while Beatrice tried to help her. Livia, in bed, watched the scene with wide eyes of fear. Ah, good, you've arrived, Uncle, Marlene said with a cold smile. I was just showing them some interesting photos of the accident that killed Livia's grandfather. Fascinating how history repeats itself, isn't it? Franklin felt something inside him break. Decades of guilt, regret and pain turning into an icy fury. Enough, he said, his voice carrying an authority he hadn't shown in years. It's over, Marlene. Over? She laughed, but there was something hysterical in her laughter. Nothing's over, Uncle. I still have all your secrets in my hands. All the documents, all the evidence, like the documents about what you did to Joey Rizzo. Franklin asked calmly. Marlene's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, he continued, limping into the room. Just as you know exactly why you chose to persecute Clarice and Livia. All these years? They're con artists, Marlene exploded. They're trying to steal everything we've built. They're the people you chose to punish for your own guilt, Franklin corrected. The daughter and granddaughter of the man you killed to control me. The envelope slipped from Marlene's hands, old photographs scattering across the floor. For a moment, she seemed very young and very old at the same time. the 22-year-old girl who had committed her first murder, and the bitter woman who had built a whole life on that foundation of blood. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I did everything for you, for us, for the company." "No," Franklin interrupted her. "You did it for power. And now it's over." As if to underline his words, sounds of sirens began to be heard in the distance. Approaching rapidly, Clarice regained consciousness slowly, the voice of Livia calling "Mommy" being the first thing she registered. When she opened her eyes, she found herself lying on the living room sofa, surrounded by worried faces. Dr. Evans was beside her, checking her vital signs, while Beatrice held a glass of water with a straw. "What?" She tried to sit up, but the world spun violently. "Slowly," Dr. Evans instructed. "You had a very strong shock." The memories began to return in confused flashes. Marlene entering the room, the photographs, the revelation about her father, the truth about his death, about the accident, about everything. "Where is she?" Clarice asked, her voice trembling. "The police took her," Gus replied softly, "along with all the evidence the investigator found." Clarice closed her eyes, feeling warm tears run down her face. 20 years. 20 years believing that her father had died in a stupid accident, that fate had been cruel for no reason. And now... "Livia," she called suddenly, the panic evident in her voice. "Where is my daughter?" "She's in the room with Franklin," Beatrice replied quickly. "She's safe." In the room, Franklin was sitting on the edge of Livia's bed, watching. The girl who had finally fallen asleep, exhausted after all the commotion. Her small fingers still gripped his hand tightly, as if fearing that he might disappear if she let go. "She was worried about you," he said when Clarice appeared at the door, supported by Dr. Evans. "But she didn't want to leave the room because she promised she'd try to move her toes more today." The simplicity of that childish concern amidst so much chaos made something break inside Clarice. Her legs gave way, and she would have fallen if the doctor hadn't held her. "Why?" she whispered, letting herself slide down to sit on the floor. "Why did she do that? Why did she destroy my life, my daughter's life?" Franklin gently released Livia's hand, and with difficulty got up to join Clarice on the floor. It was an almost comical scene. Two broken adults, sitting on the carpet, of a child's room decorated with fluorescent stars on the ceiling. "Because she became exactly what I was," he replied after a long moment. "Someone who saw people only as pieces in a game of power. And I..." His voice faltered slightly. "I'm just as guilty as she is." "No," Clarice protested automatically. "You didn't know." "I didn't know because I chose not to see," he interrupted her. "After the accident, I closed myself off in my bitterness, let Marlene take over everything, do whatever she wanted. I turned her into the monster she became." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft breathing of Livia sleeping. "You know what's worse?" Clarice finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "I can't hate either of you." Franklin looked at her surprised. "My father," she continued, silent tears running down her face. "He always said that hatred was a poison that consumed first the one who carried it. Even when he discovered the irregularities in the company, he didn't feel anger, just sadness for what people were capable of doing for money." She paused, watching her daughter sleep. And now, looking at Livia, she also doesn't have hatred in her heart. Even after everything she's been through, she still believes in the good in people. How can I teach my daughter to be strong if I myself let myself be consumed by resentment? Franklin felt his own tears begin to fall. How had that family managed to maintain so much light amidst so much darkness? How had they emerged from so much suffering without losing their humanity? "You're not that person anymore either," Clarice continued softly. The person you used to be wouldn't have risked everything to protect us. I didn't do it out of nobility, he admitted. I did it because your daughter showed me a mirror of what I had become. A bitter old man hidden behind walls of money and power, and you chose to change, she completed. That's the difference between you and Marlene. You chose to rebuild your humanity. She chose to bury hers deeper and deeper. A movement on the bed caught the attention of the two. Livia had stirred, and her toes on her right foot moved slightly under the blanket. She's progressing faster than expected, Dr. Evans commented from the door, where he watched the scene discreetly. The physical therapist said she's never seen so much determination in such a young patient. She has someone to learn from, Franklin replied, looking significantly at Clarice. At that moment, Gus appeared at the door, his face carrying a peculiar expression. Sir, the lawyers are here and there's someone else who wants to talk to Ms. Clarice. Who? She asked, trying to get up with difficulty. Ricky Davis. The name fell like a bomb in the room. Clarice froze in the middle of the movement of getting up, her face losing all color. What does he want? Franklin asked, his voice assuming a protective tone. Says he wants to confess, Gus replied, about his involvement with Marlene, about the attempts to take custody of Livia, everything. Clarice finally managed to rise, leaning against the wall. Her face, once pale, now showed an iron determination. I want to talk to him, she declared. Are you sure? Franklin asked softly. You don't have to. Yes, I do, she interrupted him. Not for me, but for Livia. She deserves to know the truth about her father, the whole truth. As he watched Clarice limp towards the living room, supported by Dr. Evans, Franklin felt a deep admiration for that woman who, even broken, found the strength to face another painful chapter of her story. On the bed, Livia stirred again, and this time her eyes opened slightly. Uncle Franklin, she called sleepily. Yes, little one? Is Mommy sad? He hesitated, searching for the right words. She's being very brave. Like when she dances even. When it hurts. Exactly like that. Livia was silent for a moment, her childish face assuming that expression of ancient wisdom that so disconcerted him. Then I'll be brave too, she declared. I'm going to do my physical therapy without crying. Today, even when it hurts a lot. So Mommy will be proud. Franklin felt his heart clench. How did a child who had gone through so much suffering still manage to maintain such purity of spirit? You know what, Livia? He said, holding her small hand between his. Your mother is already very proud of you, and so am I. Outside the room, voices began to rise in the living room. The confrontation between Clarice and Ricky was about to begin, and with it, another painful chapter of this story would be revealed. Ricky Davis seemed much smaller than Clarice remembered. Sitting on the living room sofa, his expensive suit rumpled and his tie loose at his neck, he looked more like a boy caught in a prank than the man who had destroyed her life years ago. You're different, he commented when she entered the room, supported by Dr. Evans. More strong. Clarice didn't answer immediately. She sat in the opposite armchair, taking her time to study the face of the man she had once loved, the lines of worry on his forehead, the first grey hairs at his temples. He also carried the marks of the difficult years. Why did you come? She finally asked, her voice surprisingly firm. Ricky ran a hand over his face, a nervous gesture that she recognized well. Because I can't take it anymore, he replied after a long moment. I can't take it anymore living with what I did, with what I allowed them to do. Franklin, who had left Livia in Beatrice's care, entered limping into the room at this moment. His face was set in a mask of coldness that made Ricky shrink visibly. Then speak, the businessman commanded, sitting next to Clarice. Ricky took a deep breath as if gathering courage. It started soon after we found out about your illness, he said, looking at Clarice. I was desperate. looking for doctors, treatments. That's when Marlene approached me. Marlene? Clarice repeated, confused. But how did she... She knew everything about you, about your father, about the illness. She offered me a deal. The company would pay for all your treatment, guarantee. The best medical care possible. In exchange, you would abandon me, Clarice completed, the realization falling like a weight on her chest. No, Ricky protested. It wasn't that. She said it was better to separate legally so that you could receive government assistance. That it would only be on paper. And you believed it? Franklin interrupted, his voice loaded with contempt. Ricky lowered his eyes. I wanted to believe it. It was easier than admitting the truth, that I was scared. Scared of the illness, of the responsibility, of seeing you fade away. So you ran away, Clarice said softly. Left me pregnant and sick because you were scared. They told me it would be better that way, he continued, his voice breaking, that you would receive all the necessary help, that the child has a name, Franklin cut in. Livia, your daughter, whom you tried to take from her mother several times. Ricky covered his face with his hands, and for a moment only his sobs filled the room. They weren't real attempts, he finally admitted. It was all part of Marlene's plan. She wanted to create a history, to document every time you refused help, every time you chose to stay with Livia, even without conditions. To be able to use it against me later, Clarice completed, the understanding making her stomach churn, to make me look like an irresponsible mother. I didn't know, Ricky whispered. I swear I didn't know the complete plan. When I realized what was really happening, I tried to go back. But Marlene... She threatened you, Franklin guessed. Ricky nodded miserably. She had proof of my involvement in some questionable company operations. She said she would destroy me if I didn't cooperate. A heavy silence fell over the room. From Livia's room, they could faintly hear Sophia's voice telling a story. Why now? Clarice finally asked. Why did you decide to tell everything now? Because I saw the news, he replied, raising his tearful eyes. I saw what happened to Livia, how she almost... And then I found out about the attempted poisoning. His voice failed, and he needed a few moments to recompose himself. I couldn't pretend anymore that it wasn't my fault too. Every time Livia suffered, every moment of pain you went through, I allowed it to happen, out of cowardice, out of fear. Out of weakness, Franklin completed harshly. Yes, Ricky admitted, out of weakness. And now, he reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a thick envelope. Now, I brought everything. Every document, every proof of Marlene's involvement, every recorded threat. It's all here. He extended the envelope to Clarice, but it was Franklin who took it. That doesn't erase what you did, the businessman said coldly. It doesn't compensate for the years of suffering. I know, Ricky replied, tears running freely down his face. I just wanted you to know the truth, and... He looked hesitantly at Clarice. I wanted to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, I know I don't, but it's not to me that you should ask for forgiveness. Clarice interrupted him, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and strength. It's to your daughter. The girl who never knew the love of her father, who grew up believing she wasn't worthy of being loved. Her words were interrupted by a sound coming from the hallway. Everyone turned to see Livia in her wheelchair, which Sophia pushed with a worried expression. She insisted, the housekeeper explained apologetically. She said she needed to see... Are you my dad? Livia asked directly, her wise eyes fixed on Ricky. The man seemed to wither even more under that gaze. Yes, he whispered. Why didn't you love me? The question, asked with the brutal honesty of children, hit everyone like a punch to the gut. Ricky fell to his knees, sobbing openly now. I loved you, he managed to say through tears. I just wasn't strong enough to show it. Livia considered that for a moment, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Mommy says that love isn't just feeling," she finally declared. "It's doing. It's staying even when it hurts. Like she stays with me in physical therapy even when she's very tired. Like Uncle Franklin walks with me in the hallway even when his leg is hurting." Clarice covered her mouth with her hand, trying to contain her own sobs. Franklin felt his heart clench with the weight of the wisdom contained in those childish words. "You're crying now," Livia continued, observing Ricky, "but you didn't cry when Mommy cried alone. You didn't stay when it was hard." "Forgive me," Ricky begged, crawling towards the wheelchair. "Please, forgive me." Livia extended her small hand, touching the wet face of the father she had never known. "You know what Mommy also says?" she asked softly. "That forgiveness is like love. It's not just feeling, it's doing." She retracted her hand, straightening up in the chair with a dignity surprising for someone so small. "When I learn to walk again, I want you to see it. Then you can start doing love and forgiveness. Okay?" Ricky just nodded, words completely beyond his capacity at that moment. Franklin watched the scene with a lump in his throat. How could that child who had suffered so much demonstrate such a capacity for healing, to transform pain into the possibility of redemption? "Beatrice," he called softly, "take Livia back to the room, please. I think we have some more adult matters to resolve here." As the wheelchair moved away down the hallway, Franklin turned to Ricky, who was still on his knees on the floor. "Your daughter just gave you a chance that you don't deserve," he said firmly. "I suggest you don't waste it this time." At that moment, Gus entered the room with an urgent expression. "Sir, call from the police chief. Marlene is demanding to speak with you, says she has one last card that can change everything." The police station was an old and imposing building in downtown. Franklin limped down the dimly lit hallway. Followed closely by Gus and his lawyer, the sound of his cane echoed against the peeling tiled walls, marking each step like a nervous metronome. "You didn't have to come personally," Chief Hansen commented, when he received them in his office. "We could have arranged a call." "No," Franklin cut in. "I need to look her in the eyes. One last time." The chief nodded gravely, gesturing to a nearby officer. Minutes later, Marlene was brought to the room. Even handcuffed and wearing the grey detention uniform, she maintained a haughty, almost arrogant posture. Her eyes, however, revealed a disturbing mixture of despair and determination. "Uncle," she greeted with a cold smile. "Good that you came. I was missing our family chats." "It's over, Marlene," Franklin replied wearily. "Ricky has already confessed everything. We have all the evidence, all the documents." "Ah, but it's not over yet," she interrupted him, leaning forward in the chair. "You know what the beauty of keeping secrets for so long is. There's always some left for an emergency." She paused theatrically, clearly savoring the moment. "Like, for example, the real cause of your wife's death." Franklin felt the blood run cold in his veins. Beside him, Gus took a step forward instinctively, as if wanting to protect his boss. "Don't you dare," Franklin hissed. "Why not?" Marlene continued, her smile widening. "It's time for the truth to come out, don't you think? About how she didn't really die of cancer. About how those last months of treatment were an elaborate farce. Enough! About how I personally managed her medication, ensuring that each dose was exactly calculated to—" Franklin stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backwards. His cane trembled in his hand. You killed her?" Marlene's smile was now almost gentle, like a teacher explaining something obvious to a slow student. "She was getting in the way, Uncle, questioning your decisions in business, suggesting that maybe we should be more ethical, more human." She practically spat the last word. "She was softening you, making you weak." Gus needed to hold Franklin. When he staggered, his legs, both the real and the prosthetic, threatening to give way. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want you to understand," Marlene replied, her mask of coldness finally beginning to crack. "Everything I did, every decision, every action, it was to keep you strong, to keep the company strong. We were invincible, Uncle. You and I building an empire." "An empire built on corpses," Franklin completed bitterly, "on the suffering of innocence." "There is no power without sacrifice," she argued, a note of despair beginning to seep into her voice. "You were the one who taught me that. In the business world, Marlene, either you're the predator or the prey. Your words, Uncle. Your lessons." Franklin closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decades of wrong choices collapse on his shoulders. "And now," he asked softly, "what do you hope to achieve with this confession?" Marlene's smile returned, crueler than ever. "Simple. Either you use your influence to get me out of here, or tomorrow all the newspapers in the country will receive detailed proof of how the great Franklin Hartford conspired to kill his own wife." "That's ridiculous," Chief Hansen interjected. "Mr. Hartford clearly had no knowledge." "Didn't he?" Marlene laughed. "I have records of all our conversations about how Marina was changing, how she was interfering too much in business. I have witnesses who will confirm how he complained about her behavior, how he suggested that maybe we needed to take care of things." "Words taken out of context," the lawyer argued. "Maybe," she shrugged, the movement making the handcuffs clink. "But the press will love it. Imagine the headlines. Businessman conspired in wife's death for power, and of course that would cast doubt on the entire current case. After all, if he was capable of that in the past." "It would destroy everything," Gus murmured. "The credibility, the company, and more importantly," Marlene completed, looking directly at Franklin, "it would destroy your chance of redemption with that little family you want to protect so much. Who would entrust a child to a man capable of killing his own wife?" The silence that followed was so dense that it could be cut with a knife. Franklin remained motionless, his face an unreadable mask of contained emotions. "So, Uncle," Marlene pressed, "what's it going to be? Your precious newfound conscience, or the chance to really make a difference in that girl's life?" It was Gus who broke the silence, taking a step forward. "Sir," he called softly, "there's something you need to see." He took out a small recorder from his pocket, pressing the play button. Marlene's voice filled the room. "Because I want you to understand everything I did, every decision, every action." Marlene's eyes widened in comprehension and horror. You recorded, including your confession about Marina," Gus completed calmly, "and about how you personally managed her medication." "That's illegal," she protested, looking frantically at her lawyer. "He didn't have authorization." "Actually," Chief Hansen interjected, "he did. As part of the ongoing investigation, he was authorized to record any conversation related to the case." "And you just gave us the last piece we were missing," Franklin said, his voice carrying a mixture of sadness and determination. "The final confirmation of all your crimes." Marlene threw herself back in the chair, all her arrogant posture collapsing like a house of cards. "No," she whispered. "It can't end like this." "It already has," Franklin replied, standing up with difficulty. "And you know what? You were right about one thing. I really taught you to be like this. Every lesson of cruelty, every example of how power was more important than humanity. So maybe it's appropriate that I also teach you one last lesson." "What?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "That there's always a choice. There's always a chance of change. I chose to change when I saw the kindness of a child who sacrificed her own body to save a bitter old man. You chose to continue on the path of destruction." He paused, leaning heavily on his cane. "And now let's both live with the consequences of our choices." As he limped towards the door, Franklin heard Marlene begin to sob, a raw, primal cry, as if something inside her was finally breaking. But he didn't look back. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. The return to the apartment was made in absolute silence. Franklin watched the city pass by the car window, his mind a whirlwind of old memories, Marina smiling in her orchid garden, gently complaining about his long hours in the office, suggesting that the company could do more for the community. How blind he had been. How he hadn't realized that each of those small interferences that irritated him so much were, in fact, attempts to save him from himself. "You're not to blame," Gus said softly from the driver's seat, as if reading his thoughts. "There was no way to know." "There was," Franklin interrupted him. "I chose not to see, just as I chose not to see so many other things over the years." When they arrived at the apartment, they found an unexpected scene. Livia was in the living room, sitting in her wheelchair near the piano that decorated a corner of the room. Her small hands touched the keys hesitantly, producing loose and seemingly random notes. "The physical therapist suggested it," Clarice explained from the door, noticing Franklin's questioning look. "Said it would be good for her motor coordination." But there was something more in the way Livia played the piano, an intense, almost meditative concentration, as if she were trying to decipher a particularly complex puzzle. "Mommy," she called suddenly, "why is the piano sad?" "Sad?" Clarice asked, confused. "Yeah, it's playing sad notes. Like when we cry but don't want anyone to see." Franklin felt his heart clench. He approached the piano slowly, leaning on his cane. "You know why it's sad, little one?" he asked softly. "Because it's been a long time since anyone played real music on it. Marina, my wife, she used to play every morning." "The lady in the picture?" Livia asked, pointing to a photo frame on the nearby shelf that showed an elegant woman smiling next to a younger Franklin. "Yes," he replied, his voice faltering slightly. "She loved music, said it was the language of the soul." Livia considered that for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Can I learn," she finally asked, "to play real music, so the piano isn't sad anymore?" The simplicity of that request, the purity of the intention, hit Franklin like a wave. There she was again, that unique ability to transform pain into possibility, to find light even in the darkest corners. "Of course you can," he replied, sitting down with difficulty on the piano bench next to her chair. "Actually, I used to play a little too. Marina taught me." "Really?" Livia's eyes sparkled. "Show me." Franklin hesitated, his hands hovering over the keys. It had been so long. Since Marina had died, he hadn't played a single note. "Please," Livia insisted, her small hand reaching for his. Slowly, like someone awakening from a long sleep, his fingers began to move. The first notes of an old lullaby that Marina used to play filled the room. It wasn't a perfect performance. Years of lack of practice made some chords hesitant, some transitions clumsy. But there was something in that imperfect music that seemed to fill a void that he didn't even know existed. Livia closed her eyes, swaying gently to the rhythm of the melody. When Franklin finished, she gave a luminous smile. "See, the piano isn't sad anymore. It was just missing her." Clarice, who watched the scene from the door, noticed silent tears running down Franklin's face. "I think it wasn't just the piano that was missing her," she commented softly. At that moment, Sophia appeared hurriedly in the room. "Sir, sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see on the news." Gus quickly turned on the television. The news anchor had a grave expression. Repeating the breaking news, Marlene Hartford, former executive of Hartford Enterprises, was found unconscious in her cell after an apparent suicide attempt. Hospital sources report that her condition is critical. The silence that fell over the room was broken only by the sound of the piano keys. Livia continued playing loose notes, apparently oblivious to the drama that was unfolding. "I need to go to the hospital," Franklin declared, standing up with difficulty. "Are you sure?" Gus asked. "After everything she's done—" "Precisely because of that," Franklin interrupted him. "I can't let the cycle of bitterness continue. Marina wouldn't want that." "Can I go with you?" Livia asked suddenly. All the adults turned to her, surprised. "Why do you want to go, honey?" Clarice asked softly. "Because everyone deserves someone by their side when they're in pain," she replied simply. "Even those who did bad things." Franklin felt his legs weaken, needing to lean more heavily on his cane. How did that child manage repeatedly to demonstrate more wisdom than all the adults around her? "Uncle Franklin?" Livia called, noticing his hesitation. "You know what the teacher taught me today? That some songs sound sad at first, but then they become beautiful. She said it's called, what was it? Resolution," Clarice helped. "When the dissonance resolves into harmony." "That's it," Livia smiled. "So maybe we need to help Aunt Marlene's story find harmony too." The silence that followed was profound, each adult in the room processing the depth of those seemingly simple words. "Beatrice," Franklin finally called, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Prepare Livia to leave. Gus, call Dr. Evans. We'll need him at the hospital." He turned to Clarice. "If you allow it, of course." Clarice watched her daughter for a long moment. That child who, despite all the suffering she had gone through, still managed to see possibilities of redemption where others only saw reasons for revenge. "I allow it," she replied softly, "but I'm going too. I think we all need to learn this lesson of harmony." While Beatrice helped Livia get ready to leave, Franklin returned to the piano. His hands touched lightly the keys where, minutes before, he had played Marina's lullaby. "You were right, my love," he murmured to his wife's portrait. "You were always right about everything." The hospital where Marlene was admitted was different from the luxurious Santa Clara, a public building with crowded hallways and poor lighting. Livia's wheelchair advanced with difficulty between stretchers and hurried people, pushed carefully by Gus, while Franklin limped alongside, leaning on his cane. They found Marlene in a small ward, handcuffed to the bed despite her unconscious state. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, their constant beeps marking the rhythm of a life that had almost been extinguished. Dr. Evans was already there, checking the medical records with a grave expression. "How is she?" Franklin asked, his voice hoarser than usual. "Stable for now," the doctor replied, "but she took a significant amount of medication. If they hadn't found her in time—" "Can I get close?" Livia asked softly. The adults exchanged hesitant glances, but something in the girl's determined expression made Franklin nod. Gus pushed the wheelchair close to the bed. Livia observed. For a long moment, Marlene's pale face, her always impeccable hair, now disheveled on the hospital pillow. "She's having nightmares," the girl declared suddenly. "How do you know?" Clarice asked, surprised. "You can see it in her eyebrows," Livia explained. "Just like yours when you have a nightmare, Mommy, all squeezed, as if trying to escape something scary." As if responding to Livia's words, Marlene stirred restlessly in the bed, a low groan escaping her lips. "Can I sing to her?" Livia asked. "The music that Uncle Franklin played on the piano. You always sing it to me when I have a nightmare, Mommy." Before anyone could answer, Livia began to hum softly the melody that Franklin had played earlier, Marina's lullaby. Her childish voice, though hesitant in the notes, carried a sweetness that seemed to fill the entire room. Gradually, the tense expression on Marlene's face began to relax. Her fingers, once clenched on the sheet, loosened slightly. "Look!" Livia exclaimed in an excited whisper. "It worked! The nightmare is gone!" At that moment, Marlene's eyes began to open slowly. For a few seconds she seemed disoriented, her gaze wandering confusedly around the room until it found Livia's face near her. "Hi," the girl greeted simply. "You were having a bad dream, but I scared it away with music." Marlene blinked several times, as if unable to comprehend the scene before her. When she finally focused beyond Livia and saw Franklin standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes filled with tears. "Why," she began, her voice hoarse and weak, "why are you here?" "Because everyone deserves someone by their side when they're in pain," Livia replied before any adult could speak, repeating the same words she had said in the apartment. "Even those who did bad things." Tears began to stream freely down Marlene's face. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You don't know what I did." "Yes, I do," Livia replied with that disconcerting frankness. "You hurt a lot of people because you were scared, just like my dad did. But he chose to stop hurting and start fixing things." Marlene looked at Franklin, who remained silent, observing the scene with teary eyes. "It's too late for me," she said bitterly. "There's no fixing it." "Marina didn't believe in that," Franklin finally spoke, his voice loaded with emotion. "She always said that as long as there's life, there's a possibility of change." "Marina," Marlene repeated the name as if it were an open wound. "I killed her uncle. How can you even look at me?" "Because I've learned," he replied, limping closer to the bed, "that carrying hatred only destroys us from within. Marina knew that. That's why she kept trying to save us, even when we didn't deserve it." "And now?" Marlene asked, her voice breaking. "What happens now?" "Now," Livia intervened again, "you start learning the music from the beginning, just like I'm doing on the piano." "It's not that simple, dear," Clarice said softly. "Yes, it is," Livia insisted. "We start slowly, note by note. Sometimes it comes out wrong, but we try again. The important thing is not to give up." At that moment, Dr. Evans approached the bed, checking the monitors. "She needs to rest now," he informed. "The body is still very weak." "No," Marlene protested, trying to sit up. "Please don't go. I don't want to be alone with the nightmares." "I can leave my teddy bear with you," Livia offered, taking from her lap a battered teddy bear that Beatrice had brought from the apartment. "He's very good at scaring away nightmares." Before anyone could stop her, she placed the teddy bear next to Marlene on the bed. "But he has one condition," the girl continued seriously. "You have to promise that you'll try to learn the new music, even when it's difficult. Promise?" Marlene looked at the worn teddy bear, at Livia's determined face, at Franklin, who watched everything with an indescribable expression. "I promise," she whispered, her voice choked. But I don't know if I'll be able to do it alone." "You're not alone," Franklin replied, surprising everyone. "Not anymore." Dr. Evans cleared his throat discreetly. "We really need to go now, but you can come back tomorrow if you want." As Gus prepared to push Livia's wheelchair, Marlene called hesitantly, "Livia." "Yes?" "Thank you for the music, and I'm sorry for everything." The girl smiled. "See? You've already started to learn the new music." In the hallway, while waiting for the elevator, Clarice approached Franklin. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "About not abandoning her?" Franklin observed his own image reflected in the metal doors of the elevator. An old man leaning on a cane, but somehow looking straighter, lighter than before. "Marina used to say that people are like musical instruments," he replied thoughtfully. "Even the most out of tune can produce beautiful music if someone has the patience to tune the strings. And you're willing to have that patience, even after everything?" "It's not just for Marlene," he explained. "It's for Marina, for myself, for the whole cycle of bitterness that needs to be broken." The elevator arrived with a soft ding. As they entered, Livia began to hum the lullaby again. "You know what's more amazing?" Franklin commented, observing the girl. How she manages to transform even the darkest moments into possibilities. Of light. She's always been like that, Clarice replied with a proud smile. Even in our worst days on the streets, she found something to smile about, something to be grateful for. I think we're all learning from her, Gus commented softly, about forgiveness, about new beginnings. About love, Franklin completed, his voice loaded with emotion. The kind of love that Marina always tried to teach me, the kind that doesn't charge, doesn't judge, just transforms. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and the small group followed towards the exit. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Look, Mummy," Livia exclaimed, pointing to the horizon. "The sky is making music too." And somehow, at that moment, everyone could see and almost hear exactly what she meant. 6 months passed like notes of a symphony in constant evolution. The Park Avenue apartment, once silent and austere, now lived filled with music. The mornings began with Livia's piano lessons, her small hands becoming more and more confident on the keys, her determination the same as she demonstrated in the physical therapy sessions. And what determination it was. Day after day, hour after hour, Livia fought to regain the movements of her legs. Each small victory was celebrated as a great triumph. The first movement of the toes, the first flexion of the ankle, the first bent knee. On a particularly significant morning, during her physical therapy session, something extraordinary happened. Franklin was sitting at the piano, playing softly Marina's lullaby, which had become a kind of unofficial anthem of the house, when he heard the exclamation of surprise from the physical therapist. Turning on the piano stool, he saw Livia was standing, supported on the parallel bars, her little legs trembling with the effort but supporting her weight. "Mommy!" she called, her voice overflowing with joy. "Uncle Franklin, look!" Clarice, who was in the kitchen with Beatrice, came running, her own steps now firmer thanks to the proper treatment she had been receiving. "My love!" she exclaimed, tears streaming freely down her face. "Wait," Livia asked, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I want to try something." With a determination that made everyone's heart clench, she began to move one foot forward, then the other. 1 step, 2, 3. "I'm playing the piano with my feet," she declared with a radiant smile, still advancing slowly between the bars. Like the music that Uncle Franklin was playing, slow, but without stopping. Franklin felt his own tears begin to fall. At that moment, the doorbell rang. "It must be Marlene," Beatrice commented softly. Yes, Marlene, who now came 3 times a week, always at the same time, for her own rehabilitation sessions, not physical, but moral. After spending a few months in a psychiatric clinic, she had begun a long process of treatment and reflection. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old arrogance threatened to return, when bitterness tried to regain its place. But then Livia appeared with some surprisingly profound observation, or began to play her newest song on the piano, and something in Marlene's harsh expression softened. "Come in!" Livia shouted from the physical therapy room, still focused on her steps. "I'm learning to dance." When Marlene entered the room, supported by her own cane, a sequela of a suicide attempt that had almost succeeded, her eyes widened at seeing Livia standing. You're walking," she murmured. "Just like you," Livia replied cheerfully. "Slowly and with help, but walking." Something on Marlene's face transformed, a mask of years of bitterness seeming to melt like snow in the sun. "You know what that means?" Livia continued, still advancing step by step, "that it's time to fulfill the promise." "What promise?" Marlene asked, confused. "The one you made in the hospital to learn the new music," Livia explained patiently. And since I'm learning to walk again, you can be my dance partner." The silence that followed was broken by the surprised sound that escaped Marlene's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. I don't know how to dance," she protested weakly. "Neither do I," Livia replied with a smile. "That's why we're going to learn together. Mommy can teach us. She used to be a ballerina, you know." "Yes, I know," Marlene replied softly, her eyes meeting Clarice's. I saw you dance once, at City Ballet, before—" Her voice failed, the weight of all, her past actions clearly weighing on her shoulders. "Then you know that sometimes we fall," Clarice replied, surprising everyone with the gentleness in her voice. "But the important thing is to get up and keep dancing." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to underline the moment of transformation, the last rays of the afternoon sun entered through the window, creating a pattern of golden light on the floor of the room. Livia, who had finally reached the end of the parallel bars, looked in wonder at the effect. "Look!" she exclaimed. "It looks like a stage! Uncle Franklin, play Marina's music. I want to dance with Aunt Marlene." And so, on that golden afternoon, an improbable scene unfolded. An old businessman playing the piano, silent tears streaming down his face, a former ballerina with multiple sclerosis gently guiding the movements, a former corrupt executive learning her first dance steps, and a small girl who, against all odds, had not only recovered her own movements, but helped to heal the broken souls around her. Ricky, who now regularly visited his daughter, arrived in the middle of this improvised dance lesson. He stood at the door, observing the scene with teary eyes. "Dad," Livia called, waving excitedly, "come dance too." And he went, hesitant at first, but soon joining the clumsy dance that formed in the center of the room. Gus, who had just returned from one of his many errands, found Beatrice crying discreetly in the hallway. "Is everything okay?" he asked, worried. "It's more than okay," she replied, wiping away her tears. "It's perfect. Miss Marina. She would be so happy to see this." And indeed, at that moment, as the soft music filled the room and laughter mingled with awkward steps, it was almost possible to feel Marina's presence, not as a ghost of guilt and remorse, but as a gentle light blessing that improbable family that had been formed. Franklin, without stopping playing, looked at his wife's portrait on the wall. Her smile, which had previously filled him with pain and regret, now seemed loaded with approval and love. "You were right, my love," he murmured between the notes. "You were always right. Love really is the only music worth playing." And there, in that room bathed in the light of the twilight, while a small ballerina with newly healed legs taught a woman marked by bitterness to dance, while a repentant father learned the steps of fatherhood, while a former ballerina rediscovered the joy of movement, Marina's music continued to play, no longer as a sad lullaby, but as a celebration of healing, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Because sometimes, as Livia had said, the most beautiful songs begin with sad notes, but end in harmony. And on that afternoon, in that room, the harmony was perfect. "Uncle Franklin?" Livia called, her eyes shining with that ancient wisdom that never ceased to amaze him. "Yes, little one. I think I finally managed to give you back your leg." He stopped playing, looking at her curiously. "How so?" "Remember, the day we met, I said I could give you back your leg, and now I did. Not the one you lost, but the will to dance with the one you still have." And she was right, Franklin realized, because there he was, his cane forgotten in the corner of the room, his body moving gently to the rhythm of the life he had rediscovered, thanks to a small music and dance teacher who had appeared in his path on a rainy morning. A teacher who had taught him that sometimes we need to lose something to find something much greater that the true music of life is not in perfection, but in the way we transform our out-of-tune notes into a melody of hope. And so, as the sun set on that makeshift family, the music continued. Because some symphonies, like love, never really end. They just transform into new melodies, ready to cradle the dreams of those who have the courage to keep dancing, even when the steps are difficult, even when the rhythm seems lost. Just have faith in the music and keep dancing.